Well, hello there, everybody. It's Zach with KT Outdoors, and I wanted to spend a little time this morning having a bit of a conversation about soil amendments. So if you want to know what I have to say about soil amendments, that's coming up next. Welcome to today's episode, everybody. Thank you for tuning in for part 2 here of our soil amendment series. If you missed the last one, we really explored the details of the soil food web and why adding organic matter helps absolutely explode and increase the productivity of our soils by supporting the life cycles that are going on in this massive ecosystem that exists within our healthy soils. Today, we're going to start looking at some of the organic amendments that we can add to our soils to help support this life and further enhance the productivity. So when it comes to soil amendments, one of the first things that I want us to think about is all of the meals. Okay, I'm gonna just kind of group this in a great big category here, because there's a lot of meals. And not just the meal that made this delicious coffee. Anyway, let's get back into it. So when we talk about meals, what are we talking about? We're talking about all of the things that you find as common ingredients in organic fertilizers if you buy them. So things like blood meal, bone meal, cottonseed meal, feather meal, soybean meal. There's so many other ones. I've seen crab meal, I've seen fish bone meal, I've seen just straight up fish meal, which I'm assuming is dehydrated fish that is then all shredded up. Okay, but when you hear all of these things, I want you to hear a couple things. First of all, number one, most of these things, when you really boil it down, they are waste products from other industries. Okay, why do we have blood meal and bone meal? Well, they're great fertilizers, so awesome, but it's also a byproduct of the animal processing industry, right? Like, we don't generally do much with the bones of animals. The blood is the blood, right? And that's like kind of the byproduct of the whole butchering process. So when they take those byproducts and turn them into a usable resource, then that eliminates some of the waste that's potentially coming from that activity. So that's kind of a good thing in a way. Same thing with feather meal. You know, they don't sell us the feathers on the chickens, so you process chickens, you get the feathers, dry that out, grind it up into a meal. You've got an organic fertilizer. Feather meal, it's a waste product. Cottonseed meal and soybean meal, same thing. Those are the leftover byproducts from processing those things coming out of agriculture and turning them into soybean oil or things like that. Well, then the leftover byproduct is the meal, and they can use that in different ways. So you have those. And then, of course, the fish and the fish bone and the crab, of course, are byproducts from the fishing industry. So all of these things are basically taking resources out of the waste stream and putting them into a useful garden amendment, which is a good thing. Okay, so any of the meals, I'm all for those as a soil amendment. I think they're a good choice. Okay, the next ingredient that we can think about when we're listing off our soil amendments is manures. Now, there are all kinds of manures that you can choose from here. Of course, there's standard cattle manure, usually sold as steer manure, which anybody who's ever been around a feedlot operation or a dairy operation realizes what a misnomer steer manure on a labeling is, because how do you know that that actually came from a steer and not a heifer or a cow or a bull? Like, did they just have steers in there? Like, I kind of seems not common. Anyway, little insider joke there for you. But so of course there's that kind of manure. If you can find access to a horse barn system, like for boarding horses or something like that, then horse manure is another great manure that people often use. if you have access to rabbit farmers or anybody who's raising pet rabbits or anything like that, their manure is actually phenomenal because it's cold, which means you don't have to compost it and break it down before you put it into your garden. You can just put fresh rabbit manure right in your garden and it won't hurt anything. It will increase soil fertility. And then we can get into some of the more trendy and expensive types of manures. So there's bat guano, which is the manure from bats. And there's seabird guano, which is the manure from, birds that live around the ocean. There's chicken manure. Often they pelletize chicken manure and sell that as a fertilizer. So just all kinds of manures, all full of different trace elements and depending on what the animals ate, all good. As a general rule, herbivores are your best bet. So any sort of animal manure, as long as it's coming from an herbivore, you're good to go. The next one we'll call number 3 is rocks. Okay, now you hear me say rocks and you might be thinking like, wow, I dig all the rocks out of my soil. And yes, I know, I'm sure you do, because we don't want big rocks. What we want is we want the small rocks. And there are a number of products on the market today that are exactly that. It's very finely powdered, ground up rock material that is generally loaded with all sorts of trace minerals and elements and other things that your plants need to survive and thrive, other than nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which are the big 3 that are always listed on fertilizer bags. Those 3 are super important. That's why they're the ones that are listed, but there's a plethora of other things like iron and calcium and magnesium and sulfur and all sorts of different elements that make up your plants. And if they don't have access to them because those elements are not in your soil, then their flavor profile can change, their nutrient density can change, and their overall health can suffer. So adding in any sort of rock mineral-based elements is going to be beneficial. So here you're talking about things like azomite, which is a powdered rock powder that you can add in. Green sand is another one. It's a very specific type of sand that comes from very specific beaches that have really mineral rich, water and soil coming together and creating the sand there. Rock phosphate is another one. That would be a phosphorus source, but it's a common fertilizer. I've even seen glacial rock dust and volcanic rock dust all sold as soil amendments. Understand what these things are doing. They are all adding trace mineral elements to your soil that will increase the overall health of your plants. So any of those are a good choice as well. Okay, another thing that you want to be thinking about is Microrhizae, which is fungi, and or any sort of beneficial bacteria. If you can add those things, particularly in new soil, that's going to get you off to a really good start. So the one that I've seen the most is probably biotone fertilizer, or anything that you find when you're looking at fertilizer ingredients that says, inoculated with Microrhizae or beneficial bacteria. What those are is fungus and bacteria that thrive in your soil. Okay, now what people don't generally understand is that fungus in your soil is important because plants, in general terms, cannot mine their own minerals. They need those minerals to be delivered to them. And fungus, on the flip side, cannot generate its own carbon and cellulose. So what ends up happening in the soil is that the roots of your plants and the Microrhizae, which is basically the roots of the mushroom or the fungus that's growing, they form a symbiotic relationship where the fungus from the plant gets the sugars that come from the photosynthesis that the plant is doing as part of its natural life cycle. And then the fungus in turn basically asks the plant, what is it that you need that you don't have access to? And then they go and find it and mine it and bring it back to the plant in a form that the plant can use. So there's this total symbiotic relationship that's beautiful. So when you put that rock dust in your soil, that provides the fungus with access to the nutrients that it needs to mine in order to bring it to your plants so that your plants can uptake it and use it in their natural cycles. So making sure that you have some fungus in there is great. Now, a simple way to get it in there is to just go take some mushrooms and chop them up and throw them in your soil. That may or may not get the ball rolling for you. But the easiest way is probably to just go get something that is inoculated with Mycorrhizae. Microrhizae is going to happen naturally in compost as well. It's just part of that process. And we'll talk about compost a little bit more later on.
Well, thank you for sticking with us so far. We've got a lot more information to share coming up in the next part of this series, so do stay tuned for part 3 and consider giving this video a thumbs up, maybe even subscribe if you haven't done so already so that you stay up to date on the content we're releasing, and maybe even give this a share on social media so that other people who might find this information useful can find it too. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. And remember to get outside because life's better when it's lived outdoors.